Dwight Davis spent much of his life in public service to his community and his country, and he didn't have to do any of it. He really didn't have to do anything. He'd been born into one of St. Louis's wealthiest families. The Davis family money had come from his grandfather's dry goods business, which had grown into this big headquarters building in the heart of downtown St. Louis. In 1893, when Dwight was 14, his father built this mansion in what was the new elite neighborhood of the city, the private places of the Central West End. Dwight and his brothers were growing up with the best of everything: private schools, clubs, and summers in seaside resorts, where everybody was playing a new English game called lawn tennis.
And that's where he learned the game. And all of the young men who were playing were of a class that had the leisure to play these games.
It was when he went off to Harvard that Davis became one of the top tennis players in the country, winning 2 national doubles titles with his partner Holcomb Ward. Their success was due in part to their development of a new kind of powerful spinning serve.
It hadn't been all that long ago that they'd been practically serving underhanded. So these young Americans were turning the serve into a very strong weapon, and it's hard to believe that that was the first time it had been seen that way when we look at how tennis players use the serve these days.
Oh, he was a darn good tennis player. He had a very good second serve, which was very good. Whale of a cut. And it was hard to get back.
But when Dwight Davis was at the top of his game, tennis was declining in popularity. He and others thought it needed some kind of boost in public interest, and one idea was an international competition with a trophy, like America's Cup in sailing. So Davis paid $750 out of his own pocket for the creation of this big silver bowl, the International Lawn Tennis Challenge Trophy, what his friends dubbed Dwight's Pot, and what we call the Davis Cup. In 1900, the all-Harvard American team, including Dwight Davis, challenged and defeated Great Britain in the very first tournament. Dwight Davis would see in his own lifetime the Davis Cup competition achieve what he had hoped, an event with international participation and popular interest. And he would forever be known as the Davis Cup Davis, no matter what else he did.
I think he hoped he had made some additional contributions to government and to the world, and I think he was always, it was a little rueful at some points, I think, about how all anybody really knew was the cup.
Today, the Tennis Center in Forest Park is named for Dwight Davis, not just because of the Davis Cup or because he was Secretary of War, but because of the years between Harvard and Washington, the years he spent back home in St. Louis. He had come back to go to law school, but he never really became a lawyer and didn't really need a job. But there were a lot of things a rich, well-connected young man could do in the city. Boards and committees to serve on, and of course there was politics. And Dwight Davis was coming back home to St. Louis at a very exciting time in this city's history. St. Louis was getting ready for the World's Fair, and it was working hard to clean up its image. An anti-corruption campaign was being led by the circuit attorney, Joseph Folk, and government and business leaders were being indicted for bribery and corruption. There was also a push to do something about the terrible conditions in the city's slums. A lot of this reform was spearheaded by women, social workers, and reformers backed by well-to-do society ladies like Dwight Davis's mother. She was involved in the group that was pushing to have playgrounds built in the overcrowded city neighborhoods and to build and operate public bathhouses. Dwight got involved and he began to make a real difference, not so much as an innovator or a visionary, but as the man who could make things happen.
In some ways, Dwight Davis ends up behaving, I think, as much like the wives of businessmen as he does a businessman himself. I think that one of the things that's really important about him is his position in St. Louis society. You know, again, he has the wealth to give his time to the public, and that's very important. He also, though, has the connections to get things done. He knows how to play the game, which is something that the women who set up the Vacation Playground Association didn't know how to do.
The real spark plug in the reform movement in St. Louis was Charlotte Rumbold, who had investigated overcrowding and unhealthy conditions in city slums and campaigned for playgrounds, bathhouses, and summer youth programs. She found in Davis an important ally in the fight for change. They both believed that outdoor recreation would make healthier and better citizens. When Davis became the city's Parks Commissioner in 1911 with Rumbold as secretary, they built ball fields and public tennis courts and set up citywide baseball and soccer leagues. No longer were parks places to be gazed at and strolled through. Dwight Davis took out the "Keep Off the Grass" signs. He said if it came down to a choice between people and grass, he'd sacrifice the grass. It was under Dwight Davis's guidance that the rebuilding of Forest Park after the World's Fair was completed. It had the landscaped and pretty places, but Davis also filled much of the rest of the park with his public ball fields, tennis courts, and a golf course. Although some, but not all, racial barriers were still in place, there was much greater emphasis on public access and use, and there was much greater economic and social diversity now in the city's parks.
He even noticed that a lot of the people who were out there playing golf and tennis were doing it in work clothes, and some of them even barefoot, and he thought that was a good thing.
In 1914, Davis and Rumbold organized The Pageant and Mask, an epic production in Forest Park portraying the history of St. Louis. It was the biggest event in the city since the World's Fair. Everyone was invited, and 400,000 people came.
Dwight Davis ends up being one of the driving forces behind a new patriotism among all classes and all ethnicities in the city in terms of belief in their own city and calling St. Louis their own city.
Charlotte Rumbold said, "The city that plays together shall work together." That was Rumbold's philosophy, and it was Davis's job. By the time he left the job in 1915, this man who had a private tennis court behind his mansion on a gated street had helped democratize St. Louis's parks.
You know, that was one of the things that people said about him, having attended a series of private schools. He comes out a nice guy. And I think that that's one of the reasons why he was able to do so much work, and it seems to us today like so much of it is behind the scenes. When again, he could have stood in the way of so many projects, you know, regardless of who they belonged to, and he didn't, you know, regardless of who started them.
It's typical of Dwight Davis that when America entered World War I in 1917, he answered the call at the age of 36 and ended up not behind a desk, but at the front. He ended the war a lieutenant colonel with a Distinguished Service Cross awarded for extraordinary heroism and courage in battle. He also saw some action on the tennis courts of France. He played in this Army tournament while he was waiting to be shipped home after the war. It seemed that Davis, this athlete, businessman, civic leader, and war hero, should go back home and run for public office. But he was a man who thought his record should speak for itself. In 1920, he entered the Missouri Senate race, lost in the Republican primary, and never campaigned for office again. Davis got to Washington anyway, appointed by the new Republican administration to serve on a federal board. In 1923, President Calvin Coolidge named him Assistant Secretary of War. His job? Fix the problems America had had mobilizing private industry in World War I. Davis was, after all, a man who knew boardrooms and battlefields.
He saw so many shortages of shoes, of harnesses, of even horses while he was serving in France that he felt from personal experience that it was crucial that the country be ready the next time with suppliers.
The result was the Army Industrial College, where officers would be trained not in battlefield tactics, but in procurement and supply. Typically, it wasn't Davis's idea. He was just the one who made sure that it got done. Davis also was serving as the president of the U.S. Lawn Tennis Association, and he got President Coolidge out on the White House lawn in 1924 to draw the pairings for the Davis Cup competition. Davis would make more controversial headlines the following year. The issue was American air power, and the relentless criticism of the Army by Colonel Billy Mitchell for failing to build the Air Force he was convinced would be key to winning the next war. Mitchell was a popular public figure, and he was right in much of what he was saying. In 1925, Davis, now the acting Secretary of War, ordered Billy Mitchell disciplined for his scathing public accusations about his superiors. The court-martial and special hearings were front-page news, and Davis's cool testimony and handling of the explosive situation helped convince Coolidge to promote him to full Secretary of War. Davis was a man who would take the heat for the president, but never steal the limelight.
Well, I think Davis was really very secure in his position in life, and I think he was very comfortable letting other people take the credit. And when people would talk about his war service, he would talk about, oh yes, but the rest of the men were, they were all valiant.
In 1928, Secretary Davis and two of his daughters set off on an official tour of the American Pacific Territory, the Hawaiian Islands. It was a leisurely trip on the USS Pennsylvania, with Army Signal Corps photographers capturing the athletic secretary in a game of deck tennis. During the visit, he inspected troops and barracks, attended receptions and a traditional Hawaiian feast, and he hit a golf ball into a volcano. Dwight Davis wasn't going to make much history as a Secretary of War during peacetime and isolationism. But it was more than a job of tours and public appearances, like this demonstration of a pre-Jeep rough terrain vehicle riding up the steps of the Army War College. Davis did promote development of technology, including tanks, and he laid the groundwork for the mobilization which would help win the next war.
And get the job done. That's a pretty good way of expressing it, And he'd work on whatever he was doing. He'd go at it and see to it, and you could depend upon him.
And that's why Dwight Davis ended up halfway around the world in Manila in 1929. The new president, Herbert Hoover, sent him here to be the Governor General. The United States had controlled the Philippines since the Spanish-American War and had mixed feelings about being a colonial power. This was a job that was hard to do well, easy to screw up, the perfect job for Dwight Davis.
He had a nice attitude about working with people from other cultures, and I don't think you always found that in American politicians of that era. For instance, he started having these fine Filipino players come over and play with him on the courts there at the Malacanang Palace in Manila, and the Filipino people were just so impressed by this. He said, I just did it because I wanted good exercise, but it has had benefits way out of proportion to what I did.
It was consistent with his whole life. In Manila, at Harvard, back home in St. Louis, Dwight Davis was a believer that good things can come from people playing together, from competition between neighbors and neighborhoods, cities, and countries. The Davis Cup was just the first and most famous example. Teams from all over the world are still playing for that cup, and tennis players are competing not for themselves, but as representatives of their countries. Exactly what Dwight Davis had meant it to be. He died in 1945, a few months after the war ended, at the age of 66. He started his life as one of the richest kids in town, and he might have ended up with nothing more than a big, impressive tomb overlooking St. Louis, a monument to the wealth and position that he was born into. Instead, his grave is marked by a much simpler stone in Arlington National Cemetery.